the English, long before the Industrial Revolution, were living like capitalists. You could find land transfer, property transfer going across all classes, all sexes, things passed on to women by male benefactors. And this was going back as far as records could be found, the 1300s. And going back to that point of liberty and wealth being important to the English person, I suppose later British, is foreign observers would say everyone was finely dressed and cared about what it was that they ate and drank, and we haven't seen people live like this. And there was this liberty in the air. And Macfarlane goes on to say people think Magna Carta was this new invention, but it wasn't. It was a codifying of what already existed. It was putting to paper so that it couldn't be taken for granted again. And I'm just thinking about this tabula rasa idea at the political level. And the reason why I said, excuse me if this is a leading question, is Tony Blair is someone from a party which obviously influenced by the ideals of Marx. And he himself, as you've quoted in the book, refers to himself as an iconoclast, and he's proud of that. And also talked a lot about a global borderless society, this cosmopolitan society. I guess, and maybe we can unpack just how big the constitutional changes might have been to England, but how much do you think we might actually need to codify an institution now, given that the British Constitution is not codified, to be able to retain some of those things that are at risk from being swept away?
Well, yeah, another good question. Personally, I'm not a great. I haven't got much faith in constitutions. Partly being a French historian. I think the French have had 16 or 17 constitutions since the Revolution, and the one that they have now, which has been in some ways quite successful, has got them into a terrific mess, an insoluble political mess. So I think the problem with constitutions, and of course you see similar things with the American Constitution, which has taken on a kind of quasi-religious status as holy writ, and yet it causes the Americans enormous problems and prevents them from doing quite sensible things we Brits might think, like controlling gun ownership, because of some interpretation of an 18th century constitutional clause, which we had a very similar one in the Bill of Rights, the right to bear arms, but this was seen as a political right, not a personal right. But you know, we could bear arms. People walked around with pistols and so on until it was decided this was not a very good idea, and so it was stopped. But the Americans can't do that because of their constitution. The French can't get out of their present mess because their constitutions box them into a corner. So, and the thing about constitutions is I would say they always contain problems that no one foresees, and B, a lot depends on who's actually drawing them up. And I would dread sort of Tony Blair being made president of a constitutional council charged with drafting a British constitution. And you can just imagine the sort of people who'd be on the committee and who'd be doing it. So I feel that it's probably a dangerous thing to do. It might well sweep away rather than preserve many of the things that you and I value. The common law was indeed, as you said earlier, often thought of as the thing that defined what Englishness meant, or one of the things that very much defined it. It was the property of everyone. It was the king's law, but it was one that people wanted because it was what gave them security and it was what gave them rights. And I think it's I'm going to be sounding like in every way a terrible reactionary to some people, but I think it is worrying. And I think there are quite a few lawyers who think this too, that there has been a trend for judges to greatly increase their power effectively in making law or interpreting law in a way that they think right. This is partly the influence of international institutions like the European Court of Justice and so on, and partly the influence, I think, probably of European Roman law, in which, unlike the common law tradition, which is based on in a sense, is based on common sense and an acceptance of change and the search for remedies for practical problems. The Roman law is based on fairly abstract principles, which judges then interpret. And rather than saying, what did Parliament intend when it did this, which has been the common law way of dealing with statute law, you say, what is the principle behind this law and how should we interpret it in this case? And I think that's one reason why human rights law has become such a problem. It's because whereas we're used to a law that is very precise in what it says and what it does and the powers it gives, the Roman law traditions more or less says, well, what are the principles behind this law and how can we extend it and make it more all-embracing? And I think that's where we often find ourselves in collision with this attitude to the law. And I do think that the Supreme Court has, and I'm not a lawyer, has not been averse to this kind of judicial activism. Yeah.
When was it that change started to happen? I mean, in my eyes, when you read recent history, people talk about that sea change of the constitution brought in by the new Labour government in 1997. Was it then, or was it before that point that we start to see perhaps a moving away of common law and more of an abstract top-down approach to lawmaking?
Well, I suppose I might suspect it was when we joined the European Economic Community, so in the early 70s. But I think, there's probably and here I'm talking about a world that I know very little of. There may be a kind of lawyer's culture. Lawyers are often, after all, a quite international breed, and it may be that the influence of other Anglophone common law traditions like the American, which is an odd one in a way, because it is obviously it has a written constitution, it has a Supreme Court, have had an effect on the way our lawyers think, as have the European courts. And so I think there's probably been a shift of the way lawyers think about the law in a way that they didn't previously. I mean, I think as I understand it, the common law still retains a great deal of its specific character, which is why so many, especially in commercial law, why so many overseas companies want cases to be tried in London. But nevertheless, I mean, I remember a distinguished judge once saying to me he thought that the influence of European law was having a major effect on the common law. Well, maybe that will stop to some extent, or perhaps it's stopped already after Brexit. But it certainly has been happening.